All right, so in our last section of notes, we talked about suffrage and the Civil Rights Acts that were intended to lessen voter discrimination. We talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1957, 1960, and 1964, and how each one of these definitely increased the amount of African Americans that were voting, but did not allow for all to vote. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we finally saw voter discrimination eliminated at all levels, local, state, and federal. Also in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there was a restriction on those states where a majority of the electorate had not voted in 1964. This was called pre-clearance, and it basically said that no area that allowed voter discrimination could change their election laws or add additional ones without it being approved by the Department of Justice, or they had to be given pre-clearance in order to move forward with election law changes. So in this section of notes, we're going to talk a great deal about voter behavior. These are some of the things that we're going to focus on. So we're going to examine the problem of non-voting in this country, look at some of the reasons as to why people don't vote. We're going to identify those people who, again, typically do not vote. What groups of people are we really talking about? We're going to examine the behavior of those who vote and those who do not. And we're going to understand the sociological and psychological factors that affect voting and voting behavior. Introduction. So what factors influence voter behavior? Voters are influenced by sociological factors such as income, occupation, education, gender, age, religion, ethnic background, geography, and even family. So we look at one example here, education. So typically, if we look back as far as the 2000 election, those who graduated with a college education typically voted as a Republican. Those who only graduated high school typically voted as a Democrat. And those with a grade school education voted Democratic as well. So voters are also influenced by psychological factors such as political party identification, specific candidates, and key issues. Non-voting. So millions of Americans do not vote. Specifically, our younger generation tends to not vote. Many people who do not vote did not cast votes for every candidate on the ballot. People who do vote do not cast votes for every candidate on the ballot. These people are called non-voting voters. Statewide offices in the presidency receive the most votes. Voter turnout is highest in presidential election years. More people vote in general state elections than in primaries or special elections. Voter turnout varies from election to election, but presidential elections always draw more voters than off-year elections. What factor does the blue on the top of each bar represent? And what is that factor called? The blue here represents votes for the president. The green represents votes for representatives during a presidential election. And the factor represented here would be a psychological factor. People who cannot vote. So many people cannot legally vote. This includes resident aliens, people with disabling mental conditions, and adults in prison. Many others simply cannot vote. Some 5 to 7 million people are too ill or disabled to vote. Other people do not vote due to their religious beliefs or because they are traveling. Others may not be able to vote due to discrimination aimed at them. So why do people choose not to vote? They may feel that their votes will not influence local or national government, or they may not trust political institutions. They may believe that conditions will remain fine even if they do not vote. And Western voters in presidential elections may feel that the election has been decided by Eastern and Central states before they can vote. Other factors also affect whether voters show up at polls. This could be cumbersome election procedures, for example, just simply meaning that people who previously hold office have a very high chance of being re-elected. And then so, what is the point in trying to get someone different into office? Inconvenient registration requirements would be another example. Long ballots, long lines at polling places. These all discourage voters from turning out on election day. Bad weather also tends to discourage turnout. They are sometimes also uninformed or just uninterested altogether. Voters versus non-voters. The people most likely to vote have higher levels of income, education, and status, are older, married, longtime residents with strong party affiliation. So what does this cartoon suggest about voter apathy? All right, so if we take a closer look here at this political cartoon, on the left, the father is saying, son, in a dictatorship, the people vote, but they don't have a choice. And then the son says, oh, I see, and in a democracy, the people have a choice, but they don't vote. And so there's a lot of truth to this political cartoon. We see this a lot with our younger generation. We live in a democracy, and so the younger generation knows that they have the right to vote, and so they almost feel as if, what do we really need to fight for? What do we really need to change? Or what do we not like about our government? And a lot of the younger generation are kind of content and happy with the way that things are for the most part. And so voting doesn't really matter to them because they have the rights that they believe that they deserve. But in a dictatorship, you are controlled. And you don't have the right to do a lot of things. And so your right to vote is going to be very important to you because you're going to hope that if you have the right to vote, you have other rights. But also, if you have the right to vote, there's hope that changes can be made and you can live a better life. That you can have freedom. That you can live in a country where you are free to do as you please. I also want to point out that when people choose not to vote, it's typically for more than one reason. It could because of the generation that they live in. It could be because of their parents and their parents' influence over them. It could be because they are uninterested. Again, there can be a number of reasons, and normally we see these reasons kind of combined, and then again result in low voter turnout. What three sources are used to gather data about voter behavior? The results of specific elections, scientific polls and surveys of public opinion, studies of political socialization, and this is just how people gain political attitudes and opinions. So as far as scientific polls and surveys of public opinion, the polling of scientifically determining cross-sections of the population is the method by which public opinion is most often identified and measured. The Gallup organization conducts perhaps the best known of these polls today. As far as political socialization, this involves all of the experiences and relationships that lead people to see the political process and to act in it as they do. Voters are influenced by a combination of sociological and psychological factors. Sociology includes a voter's personal qualities and their group affiliations. Sociology is the study of groups and how people behave in those groups. The sociological factors affecting voter behavior are really just the many pieces of a voter's social and economic life. Psychology includes how a voter sees politics. It is the study of the mind and the individual behavior. The psychological behavior that influences voter behavior are a voter's perceptions of politics, that is, how the voter sees the parties and the candidates and the issues within an election. These two are very closely related and constantly interact with one another. How voters look at parties, candidates, or issues is often shaped by their own social and economic backgrounds. Sociological influence. Every voter has several qualities that combine to influence their votes. A majority of the following groups tend to vote Republican. Voters with higher incomes, such as professional and business people, voters with higher levels of education, older voters, though this has varied in the past 30 years, and Protestants, or early immigrants. A majority of the following groups tend to vote for Democrats. Women, by a 5 to 10% margin, African Americans, Latinos, Catholics, and Jews. Also, people who tend to vote for Democrats have lower income, less education, they're younger. Now, the main reason that Catholic and Jews tend to vote for Democrats was because they were greeted with hostility from Protestants, and Democrats stepped in and offered help. Minority groups, Democrats have strengthened social welfare programs, so they tend to vote Democratic. And as I said, African Americans do tend, and other groups, non-white groups, do tend to vote Democratic. Geography affecting voting. Southerners once voted heavily Democratic, but now Republicans win many Southern elections. A majority of voters in big cities tend to vote for Democrats. A majority of voters in the suburbs, small cities, and rural areas tend to vote Republican. In general, family members tend to vote in similar ways. Party affiliation. Party identification is the strongest predictor of how a person will vote. Party loyalists are likely to vote for all of their party's candidates in any election. So party identification or affiliation is whether you are a Democrat, Republican, Independent, member of the Green Party, Constitution Party, and so on and so on. This tendency has increased recently as more people identify themselves as independents with no party affiliation. More people are also willing to vote for some candidates from the opposing party, splitting their ticket. The majority of Americans identify with one or the other major parties early in life, and this may never change. They support that party election after election with little or no regard for either of the candidates or the issues. Straight ticket voting. This is the practice of voting for candidates only one party in election. So you vote all Democratic or you vote all Republican. Split ticket. This is the practice of voting for candidates of more than one party in election, and it's very common today. So this would be that you vote for some Republican candidates and then some Democratic candidates. Independents. It is estimated that from 1/4 to 1/3 of all voters today are independents. Independent voters also tended to be less concerned, less informed, and less active in politics than Democrats or Republicans. In recent years, a rising number of independents are young people with above average levels of education, income, and job status. Candidates and issues. Short-term factors such as particular candidates or key issues can swing voters in a specific election. The image projected by a candidate, personality, style, character, appearance, and ability influences voters. Emotional, publicized issues such as civil rights, war scandals, or the economy can also sway voters. The nature of politics over the period have led to increased concerns on key issues, probably because people don't want to see history repeat itself. And some of these periods that I'm referring to would be like the Civil Rights Movement or wars, scandals, depressions, etc. So why vote? Is it really true that only those persons who vote have a right to complain? Why or why not?